They called her the true Queen of France, even though she never actually married the king. In fact, she wasn't even his only mistress, just one of the dozen, or 14 depending on who you ask, women who are rumoured to have had affairs with this monarch. And she only held this position for a mere 10 years before losing out in the behind-the-scenes battle for the Sun King's attention, eventually falling victim to courtly intrigue. But not before she managed to give Louis a whopping 7, some say 8, children, in addition to the 2 she had from her actual husband. And this woman is none other than the Marquise de Montespan, one of the main mistresses of Louis from whom he was absolutely smitten until he became equally smitten with someone else. Today we're going to talk about Madame de Montespan, but let's not start with where and when our heroine was born and raised, though of course we'll get to that later, but with her name. In most videos and articles you'll find on the internet, this mistress of Louis XIV is simply called Madame de Montespan or the Marquise de Montespan. However, her full name is Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart. Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart. Her name is as long as a freight train, and by the time you finish saying it, you might as well have aged and seen all the other mistresses snatched up. And in writing, it's even longer. Like most words in the French language, just Rochechouart de Mortemart alone is a mouthful. She got the name de Rochechouart de Mortemart from her father, Gabriel de Rochechouart de Mortemart. He was a close associate of Louis XV, Louis XIII's dad, and also a representative of one of the noblest and oldest French dynasties. Aside from being the Duke of Rochechouart de Mortemart, he was also the Prince of Tonnay-Charente. Tonnay-Charente is one of those little places in France that you drive through without even noticing. Because of this, Madame de Montespan was originally known as Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, and if that wasn't enough, she had another intriguing name, Athénaïs. Again, let me remind you that Madame de Montespan's full name is Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart. Thank you! And the name Athénaïs, in its French spelling, strongly resembles the name of the ancient Greek goddess Athena. Madame de Montespan chose this name for herself, influenced by a literary movement called préciosité, which comes from the adjective précieux, meaning exquisite or precious. Later, this word also came to mean affected or pretentious. Préciosité wasn't just a literary movement in France and Europe, but a way of life, which, in short, involved an exquisite type of behaviour, the use of equally exquisite language, and an elegant refinement. On one hand, the précieuses, women who started this trend, and the men who followed it sometimes became objects of ridicule because they went a bit overboard with their poetic expressions and excessively affected manners. Molière's satirical play, Les Précieuses Ridicules, is dedicated to them. So, in the wake of the rising popularity of this movement, the Marquise de Montespan took on the name Athénaïs, which, of course, referenced the goddess of war, victory, wisdom, knowledge, and crafts, Athena. Greek mythology was all the rage back then, as modern-day bloggers might say. What name would you choose if you were a précieuse? Drop it in the comments and let's see how many people opt for Dionysius or Dionysia. Given my level of hypochondria, I'd probably go with Asclepius, after the ancient Greek patron of medicine. A perfect name for a granny in the waiting room at the GP. Anna Asclepia, there's something to that. By the way, I've already been recognised several times at the local GP. I'll probably start organising meet and greets there. See you this Monday at 11 oil on the bench outside the cardiologist's office. All right, and next Wednesday we'll have an autograph session in the physiotherapy room, but only if everyone shows up with an appointment, please. But back to our heroine's lineage. Madame de Montespan's mother, Diane, came from the same noble family as her father. She belonged to the old Granier dynasty and was once a lady-in-waiting to the Queen of France, Anne of Austria, the wife of Louis the Solve and the mother of Louis the Fortauve. So, unlike, say, Jeanne de Barry, the mistress of Louis XV, who came from common stock and had no aristocratic title, Madame de Montespan came from one of the most noble families with direct access to the monarchy. However, this family was still quite unusual, but then again, are there any ordinary families around us? Madame de Montespan's father was, as they say in French, chasing skirts. Ladies, jot that one down in your vocab list. Basically, Gabrielle de Rochechouart de Mortemar was a real Don Juan, but had a wonderful sense of humour and wit. Meanwhile, the future mistress of the Sun King's mother was his complete opposite. Modest, quiet, reserved, and devout to an extreme. She spent her days praying for her husband's soul, hoping it wouldn't end up in hell. There's even a funny story about the couple. It's said that one night, Gabriel de Rochechouart came home much later than usual, and his wife, with a sad and slightly annoyed tone, the kind women have when their husbands cross the threshold smelling of unfamiliar perfumes, asked, "Where have you been? Out with your demons again?" To which Gabrielle de Rochechouart replied, "I can't remember where I've been, madam, but I do know that my demons are far more fun than your angels." No wonder the children of Gabrielle de Rochechouart and Diane de Granier turned out so differently. Madame de Montespan, for example, became the mistress of Louis XIV, known for his insatiable passions, especially in his youth. He only became more devout in his later years. Her younger sister, Marie-Madeleine de Rochechouart, went down in French history as a gem among abbesses. An abbess is the head of a convent, by the way. Marie-Madeleine was a truly outstanding abbess and one of the best top managers of her abbey. And this wasn't just any old abbey, it was the Abbey of Fontevraud, where the remains of Richard the Lionheart and Henry II lie. Naturally, such a coveted position didn't come without a bit of help from her sister, who was already very close to Louis XIV at that time. It was he who appointed Marie-Madeleine to the post. Thanks to her being highly educated and eager for knowledge, she turned the Abbey of Fontevraud into a major academic and cultural hub, not just for France, but for all of Europe. Even the most prominent writers of her time would literally knock on her abbey's door to seek Marie-Madeleine's advice, which she always graciously and humbly offered. So that was the sister of the Marquise de Montespan. This doesn't mean that Madame de Montespan was some poorly educated woman whose only thoughts were of balls and love affairs. After all, to win the heart of a king, especially one as extraordinary and unique as Louis XIV, mere beauty and romantic talent weren't enough. One also had to be a great conversationalist, well-versed in politics, science, and the arts, and, of course, possess refined manners. The Marquise de Montespan had all these qualities, along with a deep religious devotion. In her youth, Françoise received her education at home, as was common in most aristocratic families, and then at the age of 11, she was sent to a convent school in the town of Saintes, which remains one of its main attractions to this day. Moreover, this abbey was once actively supported by none other than Eleanor of Aquitaine, a fascinating figure. I hope to do a video on her someday. In the convent school in Saintes, where the Marquise de Montespan's older sister, Gabrielle, had studied, Françoise was educated along with 12 other girls from France's high society for 7 years. She left the abbey walls at around 18, now bearing the title of Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente. By then, Françoise was at the perfect age to fully participate in court life. Thankfully, her mother had once been a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Austria and had connections at court, and her father wasn't exactly a nobody in the king's circle either. And her aunt on her father's side believed her niece had a brilliant future ahead of her, as the girl had been renowned for her stunning beauty from a young age. So it's no surprise that the future Marquise de Montespan quickly found herself at Louis XIV's court, where she immediately caught everyone's attention and became an object of admiration for the opposite sex. Looking at portraits of Françoise Athénaïs now, most people would probably struggle to understand what was so special about her. But let's not forget that the standards of beauty in those days, especially at Louis XIV's court, were vastly different from today's. First and foremost, the hallmark of beauty at that time was pale skin. The paler, the better. A tan was associated with peasants and labourers who spent long hours toiling under the scorching sun. So paleness was, among other things, a way to show you belonged to the highest echelons of society. Heaven forbid anyone mistake you for a working woman. To avoid any hint of a tan, ladies would always carry parasols on their walks to protect themselves from those dreadfully unfashionable sun rays. Men were just as fearful of getting a tan. For example, Louis XIV's brother, the Duke of Orléans, known at court as Monsieur, would avoid horseback riding in the sun whenever possible, just to keep his skin untainted. So, a dark-skinned lady had little chance of catching anyone's eye, unlike today. Unless, of course, we're talking about China, South Korea or Japan, where pale skin is still highly prized. The next totally unacceptable feature was muscles. While men were allowed to have them, though not too prominently for women, they were a complete no-no. Again, this followed the same logic. A muscular body was a characteristic of peasants and labourers forced to spend their days in exhausting physical work. For the privileged class, the most physical exertion they faced was strolling or dancing. Even then, one had to be careful not to overdo it and become too skinny or frail. Beauty was viewed differently back then. The ideal of beauty was a rounded figure, plumpness, rounded arms and shoulders, enhanced by voluminous breasts and hips, a small round tummy, and fairly sturdy legs. All of this was considered the epitome of true beauty. The same applied to the face. While today, sharp cheekbones are seen as beautiful, in the 15th century, a round face with a small, neat mouth, thin, high eyebrows, and a slight double chin was considered attractive. That's why most beauties of that era are depicted with this very double chin, because it was seen as beautiful. Men liked it, so naturally, women liked it too. It's amazing how much has changed since then. Interestingly, a key feature of courtly beauty in the 15th century was small but relatively plump lips. It was especially desirable for the lower lip to be fuller than the upper one. Yes, you read that right, not the other way around. The most fashionable hair colour was chestnut or blonde, and of course the curlier the locks, the better. So the Marquise de Montespan, especially in her youth, ticked all the boxes of her era's beauty standards, which is why she had so many admirers. But even the most beautiful mademoiselle of the time wouldn't have been able to win the king's heart without that all-important quality known in French as esprit, meaning wit. I think that's the closest equivalent to the word. In other words, even if a court lady had a perfect figure, face and hair by 15th century standards, if she lacked a quick wit, a good sense of humour, the ability to hold a conversation, and wasn't well educated or cultured, her chances of becoming the king's favourite would likely have been slim. Witty Françoise Athénaïs mastered this art, which is how she charmed the king. However, this didn't happen on her first day at the French court. Initially, Françoise was a lady-in-waiting to Henrietta Stuart, the wife of Louis XIV's brother, the Duke of Orléans, the same one who was afraid to be out in the sun. Thanks to the fact that Françoise's mother had once been a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Austria, Louis XIV's mother, she became a lady-in-waiting to the king's wife, Maria Theresa of Spain. This brought her as close to the monarch as any woman of the time could get. However, the romance between the French king and Françoise Athénaïs didn't begin until 6 years after she first arrived at the French court, and only after she became a married woman, a sort of unwritten rule of the time. First, get married and have children, then you can start affairs on the side. So, in 1663, Françoise Athénaïs, at the age of 23, married an aristocrat named Louis-Henri de Pardaillan de Gondrin, better known as the Marquise de Montespan. From the moment of her marriage, our heroine became Madame de Montespan, or the Marquise de Montespan. Initially, though, Françoise Athénaïs was supposedly in love with another young man named Louis de la Trémoille, who was the son of the Duke of Noirmoutier. This duke had been involved in the Fronde, the French-Spanish War. However, the Duke of Noirmoutier's son, Louis de la Trémoille, whom the Marquise de Montespan was in love with, had to flee either to Portugal or Spain after a failed duel. This is according to the court memoirist Madame de Lafayette, though other sources suggest that the marriage to the Marquise de Montespan was more advantageous for Françoise Athénaïs's family. As it turns out, it was more beneficial for the Marquise de Montespan himself, as he had serious money problems. Anyway, despite any supposed love affairs, whether they were real or not, Françoise Athénaïs married the Marquise de Montespan. Their wedding took place in one of the most beautiful churches in the French capital, a Parisian church. In her memoirs, Françoise wrote that she forgot to bring the special cushions for her knees, which were needed for kneeling during the service. So the couple had to kneel on dog cushions the entire time. Horrifying. But back to our heroine. Soon enough, Madame de Montespan became pregnant. As we'll see later, she never had any problems in that department, and less than a year after the wedding, she gave birth to a daughter named Christine. 2 weeks after giving birth, Madame de Montespan was already dancing at a ball. It's no surprise that her second child was born less than a year after the first, a boy named Louis Antoine. You could say Françoise Athénaïs quickly got it over with, giving her husband an heir, and was able to fully return to court life. Thankfully, Madame de Montespan recovered quickly after childbirth, and most importantly, she didn't lose her beauty. The location of the couple's family residence also worked in her favour. Monsieur and Madame de Montespan lived very close to Versailles, one of the epicentres of Europe's high society. This meant that Françoise Athénaïs was practically within walking distance of work. Step outside the gate, and she was practically there. Being a lady-in-waiting in those days could be considered a real job because women, especially of the upper class, didn't have many other things to do. If you've seen the film A Little Chaos, where Alan Rickman plays Louis XIV, you'll notice that this idea is well conveyed, even though the plot of the film is entirely fictional. Despite the fictional storyline, some aspects of the era are well depicted. Rickman himself repeatedly stated in numerous interviews that, in those days, a woman, especially if we're talking about the aristocracy, was merely an accessory to her husband. Just as we now highlight our image with a nice handbag, so men of noble birth saw women more as an accessory or an investment in their status and reputation. Naturally, the primary function of any lady at the time was to bear children. But if we step back from time and place and look at it from another angle, courtly ladies had very few opportunities for advancement, and all of them were tied to men. Nuns, like Marie-Madeleine, the Marquise de Montespan's younger sister, were an exception, but even then they had their own ceiling. So beauty, exquisite dresses, charming hairstyles, graceful manners, and the ability to engage in social conversations could be equated with a job, and the courtly world with a social ladder, at the top of which, of course, was the king himself. It's worth understanding that there was no other way for courtly ladies to achieve any kind of outstanding position at court, secure a brilliant future for themselves and their children, or improve their financial situation. Nowadays, we have the wonderful opportunity to get an education throughout our lives and choose from a vast range of professions, even transitioning from one field to another. But in Louis XIV's time, there was no such luxury, not even for a lady of the most privileged classes. After all, even if you were born into a very wealthy family, you couldn't always manage its assets. From the protection of a father, uncle or elder brother, a girl would move to the protection of her husband and remain in a very dependent position, primarily financially. The luckiest, of course, were widows, who had more freedom, but even then they didn't always manage to hold on to that status for long. If they were still relatively young, they could be married off again, So the career opportunities for Madame de Montespan were quite limited. Moreover, it turned out her husband often faced financial problems and eventually became deeply in debt. And Françoise Athénaïs wasn't about to settle for a life of poverty. She wanted to live in luxury. Louis-Henri de Montespan, her husband, genuinely wanted to provide his wife with the most refined lifestyle. That's why he joined the military, hoping to earn more money and win the king's favour before his wife did. However, while he was off fighting, Françoise had an affair with Louis XIV. It's understandable. When you're constantly at court, surrounded by all that luxury, then you come home and it's just a porridge for dinner, it does get to you. After being showered with compliments all day about your divine beauty and being offered a ride through the night in a low-riding carriage around Paris, naturally you want more. And since the path to financial security and opportunities for most women at the time lay through relationships with highly titled men, the beautiful, educated, erudite, and ambitious Marquise de Montespan eventually started setting her sights on Louis XIV. But of course she wasn't the only one watching him. There was a whole grandstand of spectators. Louis XIV already had a favourite mistress named Louise de la Vallière. By the way, this particular mistress is known in French as Louise de la Vallière. She wasn't the greatest beauty at the Versailles court and initially attracted Louis XIV with her gentle nature. Well, one thing led to another. Despite the fact that the Marquise de Montespan was far more beautiful than Louise de la Vallière, a fact even contemporaries of these two women acknowledged, Louis XIV didn't initially pay much attention to the lady-in-waiting to his wife. Even during relatively close encounters, the Sun King mostly spent his time admiring Louise. We don't know exactly how Françoise de Montespan reacted to this, but it probably stung because, as I mentioned, this marquise was considered incredibly beautiful. But Françoise Athénaïs didn't lose heart and devised a plan to win the king's heart. The first point of her plan was to get closer to Louise de la Vallière. Madame de Montespan became a close confidant of the king's mistress, the person she shared her secrets and confidences with. It's said that Louise de la Vallière knew about Françoise's plans to win the king's heart and even supposedly laughed at her rival, but she clearly underestimated the woman who had chosen a second name in honour of the goddess Athena. A professor at the University of St Andrews, the same one where Prince William and Kate Middleton studied, writes in his book that Louis XIV, in a manner of speaking, bided his time until both Louise de la Vallière and Louis XIV's wife, Maria Theresa, became pregnant and couldn't go out as much as before. Maria Theresa was never much of a fan of social gatherings anyway, and was generally a rather unhappy woman who lived a fairly short life full of losses. In short, just when the women in the king's immediate circle were preoccupied with preparing for childbirth, Madame de Montespan took centre stage. Naturally, the king didn't immediately fall in love with Françoise Athénaïs. He just gradually got to know her better and better, seeing all her best qualities. As I mentioned earlier, the Marquise de Montespan was an excellent conversationalist, a very witty woman, and well-versed in politics. Before long, the Sun King realised he constantly needed the delightful company of Françoise Athénaïs. At this point, historians and biographers have differing views. Some say Louis XIV housed Madame de Montespan in a room next to Louise de la Vallière's purely for logistical reasons, so he wouldn't have to waste too much time moving from one bedroom to the next. Pop into one lady's room for a chat, and then it's just a short stroll to the other. Why walk far? Other rather strange sources suggest that Louis XIV simply didn't want to upset Louise de la Vallière by letting her know she was no longer the favourite, so he visited her purely out of duty and sympathy. Then, to save time, he dashed off to Madame de Montespan's room in the neighbouring part of the Versailles dormitory. There's also another perspective often found in French sources. It claims that the Sun King placed the Marquise de Montespan in a room almost adjacent to Louise de la Vallière's to get back at the latter, to anger her and cause her pain because he didn't believe her last child was his. Whichever of these viewpoints is accurate, soon enough, Louise de la Vallière left the French court and went to a convent. Louis XIV, usually quite willing to acknowledge his illegitimate children, was much less optimistic about Louise de la Vallière's child, which plunged her into deep despair. And she was already becoming more and more withdrawn with each passing year. As for Madame de Montespan, she was openly feared at the French court for her sharp tongue and remarkable ability to spin intrigues. Rumour had it she would deliberately mock courtiers to amuse the king. However, it soon became clear that jokes weren't the only thing on the Marquise de Montespan's agenda. Although the new royal mistress managed to secure not only the king's favour, but also his passionate love, the boomerang effect is a force to be reckoned with. The Marquise de Montespan would later suffer from the same scheming she inflicted on others, ultimately sharing the fate of Louise de la Vallière. But more on that later. For now, let's return to Françoise Athénaïs's triumph, which was, however, overshadowed by her husband's reaction. Françoise Athénaïs's husband was furious when he found out about his wife's affair. First of all, he openly threatened the king. That took some guts. According to Jules Laire's book, Louise de la Vallière and the Youth of Louis XIV, Madame de Montespan's husband threatened to deliberately infect his wife with a venereal disease so that she would pass it on to the monarch. He also drove around Paris in a black carriage adorned with stag horns, a symbol of marital infidelity. It all ended with the Marquise de Montespan openly threatening the Duchess of Montausier, whom he blamed for luring his wife into Versailles, the den of lust and debauchery. For these threats, he was arrested and imprisoned for a while. However, he was soon released after promising to rid Versailles and Paris of his presence. He kept his word and moved to a country estate. Nevertheless, the Marquise de Montespan continued to plot against his wife. He told their children that their mother had died and that her funeral would take place soon. He even staged it so well that it looked like a real funeral, complete with a requiem, a tombstone, and dates 1663 to 1667, the time their marriage lasted. Louis-Henri de Pardaillan de Gondrin even forced his frightened children to attend the whole charade, and then forbade them from communicating with their mother. Because of her husband's violent reaction to her affair with the king and the widespread rumours that the monarch was cheating on his wife with 2 women, which was considered a grave sin, Louis XIV housed Madame de Montespan next to Louise de la Vallière so that everyone would think he was visiting his old favourite at night, not the new one. In any case, the affair quickly became common knowledge because it's hard to keep a secret within the walls of Versailles, where the walls have ears and the doors have eyes. Louise de la Vallière withdrew more and more into herself, perhaps because she was tired of all the intrigue, or because her status as the king's first favourite was rapidly slipping away. In the end, she left for a convent and took the name Louise. At one point, she nearly died from a severe illness, possibly measles. In a fevered delirium, she saw herself standing at the gates of hell, and upon waking decided she needed to save her sinful soul before it was too late. She decided to enter a Carmelite convent in Paris. The conditions there were quite harsh, especially after life at Versailles. It's said that Madame de Montespan publicly mocked Louise de la Vallière's desire to become a nun, partly because she didn't believe her vanquished rival could survive the conditions of near-total asceticism after a life of plenty and comfort. However, de la Vallière kept her promise. On the day she left Versailles, she bowed before the king's wife Maria Theresa and asked for her forgiveness. Maria Theresa embraced her and said she forgave her for everything. Louise also bid farewell to Louis, who, according to some contemporaries, cried for 2 hours after that. Louise spent the rest of her life in the convent, making sure her children were financially secure and had a relatively stable future. In the late 1670s, Madame de la Vallière received news that Louis XIV had parted ways with the Marquise de Montespan. The Carmelite nuns were astonished by Louise's humility, endurance, and resilience, and after her death, they claimed her body was illuminated by a divine glow and emitted the fragrance of roses. Thus, Louise de la Vallière accepted her defeat with her head held high, turning it into her own triumph. It's unclear whether she considered her defeat as such, but her departure to the convent became a symbol of her determination and inner strength. But let's return to the Marquise de Montespan. She achieved everything she had set her sights on, becoming the king's primary mistress, even driving her rival out of Versailles, and she was planning to get a divorce, something absolutely unheard of in the 17th century. The relationship between the Marquise de Montespan and Louis XIV was steeped in rumours and gossip, which was inevitable at a court where they could have published a daily tabloid, the Versailles Gazette. It was impossible to determine where the rumours end and the real events begin, so it's best to take these stories with a pinch of scepticism. Despite her beauty and status as the king's favourite, the Marquise de Montespan was known for her incredible jealousy. She could cause a real scandal if she suspected the king of infidelity. Contemporaries described her as capricious, extravagant, domineering, and quick-tempered. She even dared to remind the king that her lineage was older and nobler than that of the Bourbons. Louis XIV might have occasionally regretted not keeping a more docile favourite at court. The Marquise de Montespan's behaviour could have been influenced by both her inherent character traits and her frequent pregnancies. During the 10 years she was the king's favourite, she bore him 7 children. The first child was born at the end of March 1669. It was a girl, possibly named Louise Françoise, after her parents. She lived for only 2 years. The second child was born on March 31st, 1670. It was a boy named Louis Auguste de Bourbon. He received the title of Duke of Maine and became a notable figure at court. The third child was born in the summer of 1672. It was a son named Louis César, who lived for only 10 years due to health problems. His death was a heavy blow for the parents, especially considering the medical treatments of that time. The fourth child was born a year after the third, and it was a girl named Louise Françoise. She lived much longer than her older sister, reaching the age of 70, and married Prince Condé Louis II, though their marriage was short-lived. The fifth child was a girl named Louise Marie Anne, born a year after the previous child. She lived for only 6 years. The sixth child was born 3 years later, and it was a girl named Françoise Marie. She lived longer than any of the couple's children, reaching the age of 72 and marrying the Duke of Orléans, Philippe II. The seventh and last child of the Marquise and Louis XIV was born a year after Françoise Marie. It was a boy named Louis Alexandre, who lived for 59 years. The Marquise de Montespan gave birth to children almost every year, except for a 3-year break between Louise Marie Anne and Françoise Marie. This was an extremely taxing ordeal for her body, especially considering that not all the children survived. The hardships associated with losing children, as well as possible failed pregnancies, undoubtedly affected her health and appearance. The short interval between childbirth and loss of children added stress. With such a schedule, it was difficult to find time for recovery and self-care, which could have contributed to her quick-tempered and capricious behaviour. Thus, it's not surprising that with each passing year, Madame de Montespan became more and more irritable and temperamental. However, her frequent pregnancies and childbirths did not prevent her from leading an active social life. Just 2 weeks after giving birth to her first child, she appeared at a ball again. Contemporaries described her close circle as the epicenter of court life, evoking both fear and hope among ministers and generals of that time. Her Versailles apartments were adorned with dozens of expensive paintings, and the marquise herself, by her own admission, considered her chambers the epitome of Versailles wit. Madame de Montespan supported and patronized prominent figures of French culture, such as Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known as Molière, Jean de La Fontaine, and Philippe Quinault. Michel Dufresne, in his book Madame de Montespan, The Great Sultaness, published in 1988, writes that Françoise Athénaïs had a direct influence on Louis XIV in making state decisions. As a result, for a time, she became perhaps the most influential woman at the French court, through whom marquises, counts, and dukes tried to secure coveted titles and positions, all while the king's wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, was still alive. It's worth noting Madame de Montespan's love for art, luxury, and wealth, which significantly influenced the cultural era of Louis XIV's reign. Inspired by her taste, the king strengthened his passion for the splendor, elegance, and grandeur of architecture, interior decoration, music, and painting. Madame de Montespan, in turn, elevated this passion to an even higher level, turning the inhabitants of Versailles into virtual deities. This is why the period of Louis XIV's reign from 1670 to 1680 is sometimes referred to in terms of culture and art as the era of Madame de Montespan. Some historians even believe that Madame de Montespan's influence extended beyond art and into the political sphere despite her religious upbringing. Her mother was a devout Catholic, and perhaps these contrasts created tension. Madame de Montespan's life at Versailles was largely at odds with the religious norms of the time. Dances, parties accompanied by alcohol, and gambling became an integral part of her life, along with court intrigues and gossip. It's no surprise that the Catholic Church became one of her main enemies. It's said that in 1675, a French clergyman refused to absolve her sins before communion, believing that she should first renounce her scandalous lifestyle. Louis XIV, according to rumours, tried to persuade church leaders to change their decision through his connections, but he was rejected. This information is not confirmed, but such accounts exist. Numerous pregnancies and the stress of court life didn't add to Madame de Montespan's youth and beauty. Contemporaries noted that she was becoming too plump. By that time, Louis XIV, already over 40, was exhausted by the unpredictability of the Marquise de Montespan's character. Starting in 1680, Louis XIV began to seek a more measured and surprisingly virtuous life. Considering his love of women, luxury, and blatant disregard for biblical commandments, it's not hard to imagine that such a change seemed to be imposed from the outside, and that someone was Madame de Maintenon, the very woman who had once been the governess of the children of de Montespan and Louis XIV. At first, this might seem unexpected, but examples from history show how governesses and nannies can influence family dramas. In the case of Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon, it's clear that Louis XIV was indeed influenced by the women at his court. This doesn't mean they gave him orders on where to send the cavalry in the War of the Spanish Succession, but their authority and influence extended to certain areas of the king's life. In the case of Madame de Montespan, these areas included culture, art, and personnel policy. Madame de Maintenon's influence was even broader. Although Madame de Maintenon wasn't as beautiful as Madame de Montespan and was 5 years older, she became the second wife of Louis XIV. It's important to note that Françoise de Maintenon, like Madame de Montespan, bore the name Françoise, and their surnames were similar, but they were two different women. Françoise de Maintenon was the king's secret or morganatic wife, meaning she was not equal to him in status, which made their official marriage impossible. Nevertheless, her influence was significant, and her story represents a fascinating plot development. Madame de Maintenon was born Françoise d'Aubigné. She was born into a very difficult family. Her father, Constant d'Aubigné, was a Protestant in Catholic France, a Huguenot. Let me remind you that Huguenots and Catholics were notorious enemies at that time, despite both practicing Christianity. Constant d'Aubigné initially remained a Protestant, but later returned to Catholicism. Some French sources claim that he even killed his first wife and her lover. Later, in his second marriage, he quickly squandered all the wealth of his second wife, adding to the family's problems and instability. It's no surprise that in 1629, Constant ended up in prison, and this was far from the first time. The family problems of Françoise d'Aubigné had a profound impact on her life, but despite the difficulties, she managed to become a significant figure at Louis XIV's court, exerting considerable influence on his life and politics. According to one version, Constant d'Aubigné seduced the daughter of the prison warden Jeanne de Cardillac, who also ended up in prison, and Françoise d'Aubigné, the future Marquise de Maintenon, was born in captivity. Another version suggests that her father didn't kill anyone, but his first wife simply died, and he, along with his second wife, ended up in prison due to debts and various problems. This place became the birthplace of Françoise, and this version seems more plausible, as Françoise's mother, Jeanne de Cardillac, had high-ranking relatives who helped the family get out of their difficult situation. After being released from prison, the family was sent to the French colony on the island of Martinique, where Françoise spent most of her childhood. Although she was baptized in the Catholic faith in France, her upbringing was strictly Protestant to avoid religious persecution. Despite her Protestant upbringing, she was later placed under the care of her Catholic godmother, Madame de Maintenon, who had a significant influence on her religious views and convinced her to convert to Catholicism. This change was achieved through the intervention of her godmother, who wrote a letter to Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV, asking her to facilitate the transfer of Françoise from the hands of her Protestant aunt. Thus, from the age of 16, Françoise converted to Catholicism and married the poet Paul Scarron, who was partially paralyzed after an accident in a river. The marriage was necessary for Françoise, as she had no means of support except for the symbolic assistance of her godmother. Paul Scarron proved to be a caring husband, providing financial support and introducing her to Parisian high society. He opened a literary salon in which Françoise actively participated, and soon well-known writers and cultural figures, including the future favourite of Louis XIV, Madame de Montespan, began to frequent the salon. Thus, Françoise d'Aubigné, the future Madame de Maintenon, made a significant step toward high society thanks to her husband and her involvement in Parisian cultural life, which ultimately played a key role in her future at the court of Louis XIV. After the sudden death of Paul Scarron, Françoise d'Aubigné, now a widow and left with significant debts, found herself in a difficult financial situation. To support her, Anne of Austria, through mutual acquaintances, arranged a pension of 2,000 livres for her. After Anne of Austria's death, Françoise received support from Madame de Montespan and Henrietta Stuart, wife of Louis XIV's brother, Philippe of Orléans. When Madame de Montespan began her affair with Louis XIV, she invited Françoise, now known as Madame Scarron, to serve as a nanny and governess for her children. Françoise was chosen for several reasons. She loved children, knew how to entertain Madame de Montespan, and most importantly, was a good keeper of secrets. However, Madame de Montespan soon regretted her choice, as she noticed that Louis XIV was becoming increasingly attached to Françoise. The king found Françoise to be calmer and kinder compared to his favourite, and even suggested that Madame Scarron loved the children more than Madame de Montespan did. This led Madame de Montespan to attempt to fire Françoise, but Louis XIV not only refused to agree, but also offered her an additional 1,000 livres to stay in her post. Françoise used this money to purchase a chateau, which became known as the Château de Maintenon, and the title of Marquise de Maintenon. In the 17th century, buying titles was common practice. In the late 1680s, three key events changed Madame de Maintenon's position. Louis XIV's wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, passed away. His last favourite, Mademoiselle de Fontanges, died from complications during childbirth, and Madame de Montespan fell out of favour with the king, being suspected of involvement in the affair of the poisons. The affair of the poisons began in 1675 with the arrest of Mademoiselle de Brinvilliers, who was allegedly planning to poison her father and brothers to seize the family inheritance and live happily with her lover. Madame de Brinvilliers was arrested, tortured, and executed. This case sparked a widespread investigation that soon implicated many high-ranking individuals. Under torture or pressure, some of the accused began to name aristocrats who had purchased potions from alchemists and witches to eliminate rivals, or even the king himself. Magdalena de Lagrange, a French fortune teller, played a significant role in this case, accusing not only her colleagues but also aristocrats who had commissioned her services. This high-profile scandal affected many spheres of French society and became one of the most famous cases involving the use of poisons in political and personal intrigues of that time. When the names of the aristocrats who had purchased poisons and participated in black magic began to surface, real purges began among Louis XIV's entourage. Among the accused was Madame de Montespan, though the specific details and level of her guilt remain subjects of debate. The main source of information against Madame de Montespan was a midwife named Catherine Monvoisin, also known as La Voisin. She claimed that Madame de Montespan had used her services to acquire aphrodisiacs and other dubious substances, and that she had participated in black masses. La Voisin was notorious for her criminal activities. She performed dangerous abortions and, according to some reports, was involved in several murders. Catherine Monvoisin was accused of these crimes, and her testimony against Madame de Montespan was recorded while she was intoxicated, casting doubt on their reliability. According to English historian Anne Somerset, Madame de Montespan began her collaboration with La Voisin long before her affair with Louis XIV, as early as 1667. This collaboration strengthened when Madame de Montespan began to fear that the king would turn away from her. In 1667, she allegedly confessed to La Voisin that if she were to break up with Louis, she would arrange his assassination. In 1669, Madame de Montespan reportedly even paid La Voisin for an attempt to poison the king, along with his new favourite, Angélique de Fontanges. The plan failed, and it is speculated that La Voisin intended to poison Louis using a petition soaked in poison. However, there were too many petitions that day, and the poisoned one didn't reach the king. La Voisin did not testify against Madame de Montespan, possibly out of fear of retaliation from her client, or in the hope that her silence might help her avoid execution. This period was one of the darkest in the history of the French court, full of intrigues, accusations, and mysticism. The reality of that time often intersected with myths and rumours, making it difficult to separate truth from fiction. So Catherine Monvoisin was indeed sentenced to death and burned at the stake. After her execution, her daughter, Marguerite Monvoisin, testified against Madame de Montespan, claiming that Françoise had indeed used her mother's services to eliminate rivals and rekindle the king's passion. Given Madame de Montespan's complex character and her determination to maintain her influence at court, it is plausible that her connection with Catherine Monvoisin may have been real. The affair of the poison significantly changed the landscape of Louis XIV's entourage. The king was outraged that so many courtiers had resorted to black magic and poisonings in their quest for his attention and favour. This scandalous affair led to the expulsion of many aristocrats from Versailles and Paris. In 1691, Madame de Montespan was forced to retire to a convent, like her predecessor, Louise de la Vallière. However, she continued to receive a pension of 500,000 francs, and acquired the Château de Maintenon, where she spent the rest of her life. She actively engaged in charity and supported the arts. In the last years of her life, Madame de Montespan moved to Bourbon-l'Archambault, where she practiced self-development and self-mortification. She died at the age of 66 in Bourbon-l'Archambault, where she was taking medicinal baths. Under the influence of his new favourite, Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV forbade their children to mourn their mother's death or wear mourning clothes. Madame de Montespan's story is an example of how complex human passions and ambitions can lead to tragic consequences, even for the most influential and brilliant people. Her life and career illustrate how splendor and power can be overshadowed by internal demons and external intrigues.